Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first board focus series. And today's topic is cybersecurity and the board. The genesis of this series of webinars and later events in 2022 was a conversation I had with one of my board directors, Stephen Revel from Freshfields. And Stephen suggested we consider doing something like this to help executives who sit on commercial boards and not-for-profit boards. Basically because there is an awful lot for boards today to focus on. And he thought it would be helpful if the Chamber looked at some of the key topics that boards today worry about, cover in their deliberations, and strategize about. And given the fact that the world is digitizing at an ever faster rate, we thought we'd start with cybersecurity because this whole topic demands policies and procedures to help mitigate the risk of cyber attacks, but also what to do once you've experienced one or detected a cyber event. And we're very fortunate today to have two expert practitioners. We have Sunita from Brunswick and Jim from Control Risks. And these are two experts and practitioners who spend their entire lives advising companies just like yours on what steps they should take and what risks they should consider and what mitigating factors are there to help them, provided they are employed and implemented across the company. We're also very keen in this series not just to focus our attention on large organizations, but also the SMEs like the Chamber and the majority of other businesses in Singapore, because the attention of the board to cybersecurity is a key imperative and also a key indicator of success in running a sustainable business today. What we've got for you this afternoon is, first of all, a keynote address by Sunita, and this will be followed by a conversation between Jim and Sunita with me as moderator, and of course, yourselves in the audience. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Ms. Sunita Chalam, partner at the Brunswick Group, to give her keynote address. Sunita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. It is a very important issue, cybersecurity, and it's sort of difficult to question the fact that data breaches and ransomware attacks are on the rise, and that they have become a very significant issue for businesses across the world, including in Singapore. If you open the newspapers today, there's a sort of front page story about the PDPC finding a hotel booking site for the leak of personal data of nearly 6 million Singaporeans and Southeast Asian customers. So this really is a problem that is on the rise. I'd just like to start by setting a little bit of context and explaining the factors that are currently driving this trend. I think the first thing, and Victor alluded to this in his opening remarks, every company today is a data company, and almost every product an organization creates, from a wearable device to a smart TV, has some element of cyber and digital in it. And COVID-19 has compounded the omnipresence of digitalization, with many organizations expanding their digital footprint. The other thing to note is that in the current environment, there is more and more demand for omni-channel platforms to create the optimal customer experience. So the convergence of the physical and the digital has become more and more common. And to create more personalized experiences for customers, personal data is often very critical. And the third point is the pandemic has led to really vast amounts of sensitive data being exchanged digitally, along with a heightened use of personal devices and home networks through remote working. So with the workforce being distributed and somewhat distracted, the overall attack surface has increased. And the reality is this is coming at a huge cost to businesses. I'm going to share a slide now that shows you this. Just bear with me. All right, here we go. So this is data from the cost of a data breach report by the IBM and the Ponemon Institute in 2021. So according to this report, the average cost of a data breach among companies surveyed reached $4.24 million per incident in 2021. And this is the highest we've seen in 17 years. Whoops, sorry. Of this, what's interesting is that lost business represented 38% of the overall breach cost. So this includes increased customer turnover, lost revenue due to system downtime, and greater costs of acquiring new customers because of reputational losses. And the third point to note is that the shift to remote working has led to more expensive data breaches. So this has increased the average cost of a data breach by $1.07 million. So I think it's very difficult to argue that this is not a critical issue for businesses. And this is definitely something that they really need to be paying attention to. And I think more importantly than ever, it's become impossible to sit at the head of a company and not address the threat of cyber risk. So not so long ago, when I started working on cybersecurity, a lot of companies used to think about cyber as a technology problem, overseen by the chief information officer or a chief information security officer, or as a compliance issue to be managed using audit functions and compliance functions. Today, I would say, thankfully, a more holistic and proactive approach is generally taken. And we're increasingly seeing boards and management starting to look at cyber risk as an enterprise-wide problem and rather than a pure IT security issue. Cyber attacks are also becoming increasingly pervasive, and they can present nowadays near existential threats to companies. So in addition to the cost of a cyber breach, which can be extremely significant, there is the added burden of reputational risk and reputational losses, as well as losses through litigation. And so it's really important that boards of directors have ways to evaluate cyber risk. Now let's look a little bit more closely at what the board's role is in cybersecurity. So shareholders elect a board of directors to represent their interests. And the board, through effective corporate governance, makes sure that management effectively serves the corporation and its shareholders. And so ensuring the adequacy of the company's cybersecurity measures has to be a critical part of the board's responsibilities. Now, in the work that we do, we tend to look at cybersecurity across three pillars. And this is usually cyber preparedness and defense, the actual incident response when you have a cyber crisis, as well as a broader piece around building a culture of governance and resilience within the organization. So making sure that employees and the rest of the organization are aware of these risks and taking the appropriate measures to prevent any cyber incidents. What's important to note is that the board has a clear role in setting policy and procedures versus management and the CISO's role, which is more focused on execution around an incident. So really the focus of the board should be on ensuring the organization has in place the appropriate risk mitigation strategies, systems, processes, and controls to defend itself in case of a cyber incident. Now, this cuts across several different areas. So first, let's talk a little bit about cyber risk assessment. So board directors need to be able to determine the company's cyber risk appetite, just as it does with any other kind of risk. And to decide what kind of mitigation measures to take and where to invest resources, the board needs to consider each risk within the context of the organization's broader risk appetite and tolerance. Now, the problem today is that no matter how well you prepare, with the increasing sophistication of threat actors, there will always be gaps in cybersecurity controls. And so the most important thing for boards is to look at key assets and to have a risk or a value-based governance mechanism around them. This will help the board to make informed decisions about where to allocate capital instead of investing potentially in other areas of the business. So if I was a board member, I would be asking myself, for example, questions around which assets or parts of the organization the cybersecurity team and the leadership team focus their attention on. So for example, have they identified employee groups that are particularly vulnerable, such as customer service representatives? Do they know how many people have privileged user rights? So, the point is we live in an environment of scarce resources, and it's really important that the executive team balances investments in cybersecurity with investments in other parts of the business. And the more specific they can be in targeting initiatives towards specific systems, infrastructures, processes, and people, the better. The second area to focus on is really the board's role in setting policy to mitigate risk and protect the organization. So as I said earlier, it's not really the board's role to respond to a cyber incident. That's the role of the management team together with the Chief Information Security Officer. But really the board's role is to ensure the right policies and processes are in place to mitigate risk and protect the organization. So then what does this involve? This involves making sure that the executive team has a plan, it's prepared, and that it's preparing the whole organization for the eventuality of an attack. And it's really important during this phase to balance the controls and the red tape you put in place against the need for cyber protection so it doesn't stifle innovation, which is why it's really important that these discussions are held and these decisions led by people with a business mindset, not just a control or a technology mindset. So the board needs to ensure that management looks at cybersecurity risk and response across different lenses. So not just the technical response, but also operational impact to the business. What might be the regulatory and legal consequences? How might this affect customers and external stakeholders? Another area to focus on is establishing and agreeing upon ransom policy and related guidelines. So again, this involves pretty deep conversations between the board and the management team. The other area that we feel is particularly important is to set very clear expectations up front in terms of how the board wants to be communicated with during a cyber incident. The board should set clear expectations with the management team in terms of reporting. So for example, if they require frequent updates, they might actually be inhibiting the ability of the organization to respond effectively and quickly. Similarly, in terms of the organization achieving its cybersecurity objectives, what are the metrics that need to be looked at? What is the cadence of reporting? So is it going to be quarterly or biannual reporting? How do we measure the cyber program's performance? And really the last area is ensuring that management has the right skills and the resources in place to be able to do all of this. So what is the appropriate budget for cybersecurity for this organization? So the next question really is, what are some of the tools that might help the board play this role effectively? Really, the first area is ensuring that the board has sufficient information to be able to ask the right questions of management and the CISO. All stakeholders of an organization expect the board to be aware of key cyber risks affecting the company. And it's very important for the board to determine what it wants to know and from whom it wants to hear this information. In some cases, there may be a board director with some cyber experience, but the reality is that experience can also become out of date quite quickly. It's also important to have the whole board engaging on this and bringing in their collective experience of other areas to provide the right challenge and the right perspective in this space. So essentially, this doesn't mean all executives need to become technical experts. What it means is that they have to be able to establish the company's tolerance for cyber risk, really look at what are the key outcomes that are most important in guiding cybersecurity investment, and then really fostering a culture and processes that help them to achieve these outcomes. The other thing to mention is that the board should ensure it is kept informed using key executives within the organization, but often it's also helpful to involve independent advisors, and the board should not be totally reliant on management alone for information. We find that a lot of boards are quite open to the idea of having an annual refresher training on cybersecurity, and we've conducted these with quite a few different boards. And this really helps them to stay up to date with sort of new threats and new trends emerging in cyberspace. The second area is really assessing and preparing the company and ensuring its readiness in the case of a cyber incident. So some organizations like to conduct a cyber maturity assessment, reflecting international standards, looking at best practice. And this can be very effective in helping organizations to identify gaps in capabilities and to find areas for improvement. The other tool that can be very effective are simulations, so cyber attack simulations, and this can be quite useful for boards to identify possible vulnerabilities and really assess how resilient the systems are. So often having a board member attending a management simulation as an observer can be quite helpful. It sort of also helps the board understand how they can play a role in supporting the executive team, particularly in communicating with external stakeholders during an incident. The final piece, and again, shouldn't be underestimated, is the importance of governance and culture. Governance and culture have a huge part to play in any evaluation of cyber risk, and the right outcome always starts with the right culture. Whether it's an improvement in technical processes, whether it's management's engagement in cyber, or whether it's the engagement of the board in helping to ensure accountability. And it's really important to remember that cybersecurity is an issue for the whole organization. And leaders need to decide how to manage the conflict between usability of products and services, security, and cost. And that's really where we need the board challenging and testing processes. So building resilience by promoting a sense of shared responsibility for cybersecurity is really critical. And here the board can really play a role by setting the tone from the top. So I'll pause there. I look forward to having a discussion around these topics. But I think in summary, the most important thing to bear in mind is a lack of organizational accountability for protecting data can compound a cyber attack and make things much worse. And really, rather than treating this as a secondary or a tertiary function or something that should be assigned to a technical expert, cybersecurity really needs to be integrated across the entire company because it affects the entire company, not just in financial terms, but the fear and the loss of trust and the reputational damage in the aftermath of a cyber attack often lingers on long after the incident is over and your network is secure. And boards have an important role to play in this. So thank you very much. I'll pause there and hand it back to Victor.
Thank you so much, Sunita. That was great. And I'd also like to invite Jim to join us.
Hi, Victor. Thank you very much for having me.
Nice to have you here. Thank you for joining us. So perhaps we can start by me just saying to the audience, ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box. you will be able to upvote those questions that most appeal to you. And I would encourage you to do that because it makes my job as moderator so much easier. So a nice bit of self-interest from me straight off. So please do use the Q&A function and take advantage of the fact that we have a lot of expertise in the room with Sunita and Jim. Right, maybe I can kick off our conversation, Sunita and Jim, by just taking us back to the impact of COVID-19 on digitalization and therefore the risks associated with it. And in your address, Sunita, you talked about the heightened risk that exists because more of us, if not all of us, for a lot of the time are working from home, and we don't necessarily have the sophisticated cyber walls and the security that you'll find when you're sitting at your desktop in the office. So what are you seeing when you talk to clients and when you're thinking about these risks? What are you seeing as things that the board should think more about than perhaps it is currently doing?
So I think, I mean, that's absolutely right, Victor. And we were talking before this session began about, working from home, which has just become such a normal thing nowadays. The reality is, this is the way forward. Despite COVID, and even as things improve, I think people value the flexibility of being able to work from home as opposed to going into the office. And so I think this is a trend that will definitely continue moving forward. I think that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that, I mean, this essentially means that people are taking their devices, often working from unsecure networks in their homes, and often are working in very different conditions, right? So I have young children, and it's difficult. You're distracted. You receive emails, you click on the link, and before you know it, you're the victim of a phishing attack. And so our cybersecurity practice has seen a huge rise in ransomware attacks, and a lot of this is now happening because of someone in the organization clicking on a link that they shouldn't have clicked on, and it's becoming increasingly common. I think there are a couple of things here in terms of mitigation. The first really is obviously your security system. So I think in every aspect of cybersecurity, it's very important to think about what your response will be like out of the office. We used to invest years ago in coming up with fairly complicated playbooks, which were like encyclopedias that people kept in the office. But the reality is, you might be in lockdown, you might be at home, and a cyber attack happens. So, have organizations thought about this? How do you sort of convene an incident response team remotely? How do you make sure that if your systems are compromised, you have a backup system to go on to? How do you make sure you have access to the right tools and the right documents? And have you practiced your response virtually as well? Because again, it's very different from having a group of people in a room, handling these things together. So I think it's really important to sort of shift your mindset and start thinking about how all of this is going to work in a very different setting. The second thing I'll say is I think employee engagement and employee awareness has become more important than ever before. It's absolutely critical in organizations to make sure that people understand the importance of cybersecurity. And again, I think this is something that boards can help set the direction and the tone for. But equally, making sure that employees understand the risks of, clicking on a link or not sort of being vigilant is absolutely crucial, because in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily a third-party actor. It's actually someone within the organization, leaving the doors open, so to speak.
Now that's very true. I mean, we're all only as strong as our weakest link. And the sad fact of the matter is that we humans are often the weakest link in our own businesses. And it is so easy to inadvertently click something because, as you say, you can be distracted, and the smartest person can be a victim of one of these phishing attacks. Jim, what are your thoughts around this topic of we humans as the weakest link, and how boards and companies should mitigate against this particular risk, and the whole concept of, multiple devices, not very secure networks all the time, but because we're all working from home?
Indeed. Well, Victor, I haven't written off humanity just yet. So, because, and this is a point that Sunita made, which actually it's a very important point. Remember that controls are finite, right? So, we work a lot with our clients around understanding risk. And part of understanding risk is understanding that it never actually goes to zero. Yeah. So there's an aspect of that curve of saying, okay, as my risk goes up, I can do the controls, I can mitigate. It only goes so far. And so there's a bit of realism involved in understanding, and I'll speak about how this in the board context in a moment. But a bit of realism, I think, is important to understand that you're never going to solve every problem. You're never going to close off every opportunity, especially now. Again, technology is not only is it really pervasive in business, it's pervasive in society. And so how these tools and how we use these tools, we're not perfect, but by no means the technology perfect either. So understanding that, and I think and having sort of a mature attitude, which is to say that, okay, bad things are going to happen. We should be prepared to manage that. And again, from a board perspective, the board the board is not going to sit there staring at a screen waiting for something to happen. The board is not going to update your Windows computer or something like that. But what the board can do is to start to look at those risks. And one of the things that when we speak to people about these things is that, the starting point that in many of these conversations is, don't think about this as cybersecurity risk, right? Because cybersecurity is actually a function. The kinds of risks that the board should be asking about is, what is the risk if the personal information that we collect is stolen? What's the regulatory risk? What's our liability around that? What's the risk if our business operations were disrupted and we had to shut down from something like ransomware? So having that sort of outside-in perspective, I think, is very important, because if you think about this in sort of technical terms, things get missed, and it's really, really important, especially from an oversight perspective, is to focus not on the minutiae of it, but on what is the big picture, what's important to our organization. So when we think about this transition to work from home, which in many ways I just think it's an extension of the transition that's been going on for years with our phones, right? It's just an extension of that. It's just going to the next level. The technology in some ways now has to catch up with it more than anything else. But for the board, it shouldn't be about are you on Teams? Is that being done the right way? It's more so on understanding how is work being delivered, and what are the kinds of practical scenarios? What do those look like? How do you manage them?
Yeah, I think those are very good points, Jim, because you're absolutely right. It's impossible to bring risks to zero. The board, of course, is not, as Sunita said in her address, the board is not operational. It's not running the business. It's providing oversight, advice, it's providing governance. And part of that governance is challenging in a constructive way the management teams to say, have you thought about X, Y, Z? And I like the comment you made, Jim, that really we shouldn't sort of put cybersecurity risk in a box on its own. Because we rely so much on systems, it impacts everything. And it is about, as you say, and as Sunita mentioned, loss of data, reputational risk, the sheer cost to a business in terms of money and time and managerial time to respond to and manage a cyber incident is just vast. And I suppose I also liked Sunita's comment about, boards having a refresher course on the latest trends that experts like you both see in the course of your work, because it is ever evolving, given the explosion of digitalization and the mobile devices we all now rely on. So very, very interesting points. And that brings me neatly to this whole question of culture. probably today, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody else. The word culture is used in so many contexts that it's almost as overused as cybersecurity risks, that terminology. But let's maybe consider what we mean in this context by culture. And if you would, think of it in terms of not just the large organizations, but also the vast majority of businesses that are SMEs or startups, and those of us like me and my team who operate in the not-for-profit sector, where we have more to lose, but fewer resources to respond to an attack. So maybe I could ask you to kick off that theme or that strain of our conversation. Culture, what does it mean? And what does it not mean?
Well, maybe if I could, just to give a quick example from a sector that we have a lot of experience in, which did undergo like a culture transformation, which had a significant impact. And that's the chemical sector around safety. So if you ever worked in a chemicals plant, and I worked for a chemicals company many years ago, there's a process around culture which is drilled in at every stage. And so we've done cybersecurity work for people who operate those kinds of systems. And we broadly recommend taking the same approach, where you are encouraging people to have these near-miss evaluations, where people on a quarterly basis or an annual basis have certain objectives around recognizing these things. You can't really change someone's heart, but if you begin to start putting structures in place which says, okay, have you done this? Have you reviewed this? Have you gotten your cyber points for the year or something like that? And however it may be, different organizations, big or small, may take that approach differently. It's about having a concrete program that integrates the training piece of it, but also put some personal responsibility on staff for them to have a demonstrable effect on this. And that's something that, again, culture, to your point, Victor, I think is a very good one. It's a very sort of a nebulous term. And so from a management perspective, you want to have something that you report on. And from a board perspective, it's something you say, okay, well, how many near misses did we have this year? How many people, what is the percentage performance around some cybersecurity observations? Those are things where you can maintain that kind of program, and it really goes a long way.
Thank you. Sunita.
So, what I would add to what Jim just said is really, it's really about building resilience within an organization, right? And we've talked about it a lot in the context of COVID and how things have changed. But, getting people to understand the importance of the data that they're holding on to, what kind of data they hold, why do they need this data to function, to operate, to do their business, to run their business, to serve their customers, which parts of this are important, are sensitive, etc. Just having a much higher level of awareness, and therefore putting in place the right sort of processes and so on to protect the data. And it's the same for the organization. A lot of ransomware attacks, rather than actually attacking your data, they sort of cripple your system. They encrypt your servers or whatever it is, and then you have to pay a ransom to decrypt and unlock. And again, just making sure that that there's sort of a safety and a security mindset in everything that people do. And we do this a lot through employee engagement campaigns and things like that. But it's really important, I think, with something like this, that it runs across the organization, because it's not a technical issue. When millions of customers' personal data has been lost, it's absolutely a business issue. And so it's, just having the board and management and leadership set the tone and make sure that this is given the importance that it deserves, I think is absolutely critical. And so that really is what it's all about, right? Building a culture of awareness and resilience around this subject.
Thank you. And also what I'm hearing from both of you is culture includes individual and collective accountability. And getting that message out on a regular basis, and like all messages, you have to keep repeating it in order for it to be received and for it to register with more people. So getting that message out is so critical that our business needs this information to serve our customers, and it's your responsibility as much as mine to protect it. And I think that is the culture that we would like to see in organizations large and small. And what I was hoping you'd both say was really there's no difference. There is a difference in terms of scale, resources, size of a business, but the concept is the same, whether you're sitting in a not-for-profit like me, or whether you're running a startup, whether you've got an SME business, or whether you're a chairman of a multinational. It's the same issue of making sure there is that collective accountability, and getting people to realize that each person has a role. It's not somebody else's role. And to your point earlier in your address, Sunita, it's not IT's role. It's not the role of some, very smart ex-hacker who's now your cybersecurity chief. It's not that person's role. It is everybody's role. And I think that for me is what the cultural aspect means. And how do you think the board can best drive that, given that the board is not operational, but the board does set strategy? And this is, I've spent a lot of this year talking about boards setting positive workplace culture. Now, I've used culture a lot, but how does the board do this? How does it make sure that its intent is adequately communicated across a company? Because to me, that's part of governance.
I think there's a few things there. I would say, I think absolutely asking the right questions and challenging management on, some of these issues. And the reality is none of this is static, right? So what may have worked for all of us, you may have a company that had excellent structures and processes in place that were absolutely fit for purpose 2 years ago, but that now no longer are as a result of, COVID, remote working, all the rest of it. So the question really is, are we prepared? And are we prepared not just for, what's happening now, but what we think is going to be happening in a year or 2 years from now? And I think being able to look ahead, a little bit of horizon scanning, what's around the corner, and how do we make sure that we're prepared for that, and sort of asking those tough questions, I think is absolutely crucial. I think the other thing is really clearly setting expectations, and we talked a little bit earlier about metrics and reporting and so on. What do you want to see and hear from the organization? What do you want to be updated on? And I think just sort of setting that very clearly in terms of, what are our goals? What do we want to achieve? How are we going to do that? And then how are we going to track progress? So there's some level of accountability and follow through on some of these issues, I think is quite critical.
Yeah, and I think that those sort of common sense, which, as we all know, is not always present at every moment or in every business at every time, but that common sense approach plays to the point that I think you both alluded to or made, and that is that the composition of the board is not going to be chock full of ex-hackers or technical experts. The composition of the board is going to be a diverse group of business people who either have run or are still running other businesses. And they're bringing that experience to this particular business on whose board they sit. And I think taking that approach, what risks are you trying to manage? What is important? Your comment about key assets, Sunita, that is, I think, where the board comes in. But just to get back to my question about how does the board communicate this collective accountability? Jim, any thoughts or anything that you've seen that works in your dealings with clients?
Well, and I maybe haven't totally, I wouldn't blame humanity for all the technology problems, but I do suffer a lack of faith to a degree in humanity. So I really do believe that cybersecurity is not an organic bottom up, very much a top down. And so, when we think about what the board, that's, that maybe, it's an audit or risk subcommittee, maybe it's the whole board, depending on the size of the organization, the size of the board, that they're meeting on a specific subject once or twice a year or something like that. And, typically they're going to be presented like, it'll be a very, very structured approach saying, okay, these are the things, these are our risks, this is our mitigation strategy, et cetera, et cetera. I think, what's important is to understand what are the activities and what are the functions that go all the way down throughout the organization. And that's that idea that you are holding people accountable to do certain activities. Now, everyone has done their phishing tests, I'm sure. Some of you maybe did not pass your phishing tests, right? And maybe you got a slap on the wrist or like a pop-up or something like that. But those kinds of things are actually important. And but in of themselves, it's not something that you want to use to beat someone over the head with saying, you did the wrong thing, you did the wrong thing, you did the wrong thing. Again, it's that idea that what are you doing in terms of your responsibility around cybersecurity? So maybe that you're making observations about something, maybe that you're required to, have an activity or something like that, that brings you into that process. It doesn't have to be a full-on, cybersecurity crisis management exercise or something like that. It could be a small quiz. It could be, what I often suggest is something that not necessarily like an annual training program that people click through, they're done, but smaller things that can happen throughout the year, maybe around specific subjects or specific concerns that you can start to generate information. That information can give you some insight, and that's what you can begin to report to the board. Now, when the board looks at that, the board is often presented a very nice, neat picture, right? So it's neat that to your point, I mean, having an independent view of that's important. And so the board's ability to be able to reach out beyond just the management committee and to talk to people inside the organization to get a better understanding, I think is important. But to be honest, very rarely see boards do that. They really, they have a very curated view and they're given a very curated message. And, they don't necessarily proactively go out and try to understand what's going on the ground. And, if you don't, then you're kind of flying by.
Yeah, and I think that's the risk for the board, isn't it? That
Indeed.
If board members don't take the initiative to ask the right questions or to find out what is going on, either in the business or in the sector, or from their own businesses where they manage or are running businesses, then I think they're not adding value to the business that they're currently sitting on the board of. You're absolutely right about sort of annual, sort of refresher courses for staff. They don't work because they become mechanical exercises where people try to game them. And I remember this from my days in banking, where to get people to complete their annual compliance education was a real struggle, and people would not take it seriously, and then they would be taken to task, and it all got very fraught. And one of the things I've seen that works very well is exactly this point, that where incidents happen, the incident, the learning from that, and the mitigating steps taken, hopefully to prevent a reoccurrence of either the same or similar risks, having that shared, without sort of a blame game across an organization is very, very helpful. Because we humans tend to respond not to sort of, the annual compliance check approach, where you sit and do a sort of e-test for an hour and then get told you fail. But we respond to real world situations. And by thinking, what would we do if we were in Victor's shoes on that particular day at that particular time? And I think that is the sort of learning that the board can encourage the senior management team to implement, where it's not already in place. And I think,
we do. I mean, we do a lot of simulations with clients, and it's really interesting what comes up during these discussions, because we have you have a sort of a series of scenarios that you work through. But very often you find that in the midst of the discussion, it's sort of everyone stops at something and realizes actually we have no idea what we would do. I mean, one of the things we hear quite often is we have no idea what we would do if we got asked to pay a ransom. What would we do? Could we even pay a ransom? Is that even possible? And so I think it's a lot of these things. It's just putting yourself in that situation so that you can actually think about, break it up a little bit and think about each of those things individually and what that would then mean. Is this something that we could do? Is it legal? If we had to do it, how would we do it? I mean, but most people haven't really thought about it unless they've been put in that situation. And it's quite helpful to have thought about some of these issues in advance. Indeed,
and again, that's a very human characteristic, that we don't think about something until it impacts us, and that focus is another theme of functioning boards, where they do give themselves the time to focus on what are the key assets, what are the risks we're running, and what will we do if X happens. And I think that's a great approach to take, because their experience can then help the senior management team, which, by definition is not going to have thought of everything, which is why there's a board providing input, advice, governance, and sometimes warning about the state of the company and how it's being run and managed. So that's great. Let me just take a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I hope that by doing so, that will encourage more people to ask questions. So we've got, first of all, a question from Chong Chung. Is cybersecurity trained personnel still in serious shortage? And how bad is the situation in Singapore and the rest of the world?
Yes. Hiring someone was hard. So yes, it's very much still a crisis. And, honestly, it makes you kind of wonder, I mean, obviously we're a global firm, so to a certain extent, our people can be anywhere. But finding those skills in Singapore, it's harder and it's more expensive.
Absolutely. And again, it comes back to the point you both made, that this is not necessarily a cyber security personnel issue. But my favorite phrase of the ex hacker now working for the good guys. It's not just a question of that. It is accountability across the organization, just as much as it's driven by the focus on the issue from the board. All right, so Michael asks, how important or useful are data protection trust marks? And are there international benchmarks or best practice for such a mark? This sounds like a standards question to me. Any of you like to take that one?
Well, here, let me take a first stab. Yes, it's useful, but compliance is not security. And so when you see something like that, depending what it might be, and it could be ISO 27001, any number of these different certifications, SOC 2, whatever it might be, depending on what kind of organization that you're working with. You just take it with a grain of salt, because again, they could have all things. So the way I look at it, like having like a certification like that, it's like going to the doctor. The doctor says, "Oh my gosh, you're completely healthy. You're fine. You're doing everything right." That means that all your cybersecurity practices are great. You think, "Oh my gosh, great, I'm fine." And you walk out the door, you get rid of a live bus, and you're dead. That's like a cybersecurity incident that you can't control. And so while those can be important, and especially from a due diligence perspective, around thinking about your business partners or who's going to be handling your information, it's informative. What we would always say is that you can't really transfer the risk that way. And so you need to understand that again, even if they could do things so well, there's still a possibility, and so the risk never goes away.
Yeah, that's very insightful. Richard says, interested to hear if you've handled the real ransomware in your organization, how you handled it, and what could have been done better. Have you come across this when you're dealing with clients? I'm sure you have. And what sort of lessons can you share with our audience?
have a very good backup. You don't have a, if you don't have a good backup, it's very simple. It's either backup, or you accept that you're going to lose data, or you pay money. It's kind of, it's as simple as that. But to Sunita's earlier point, that process of deciding if you want to pay money, that becomes a very fraught description, a very fraught process where how do you find the people to do it? You know, should I do it? Should someone else do it? What do I say? You know, and the problem is that, you know, the people who are the ransomware criminals are part of a vast criminal underground economy. This is their day job, and they're pretty good at it. And so that aspect of understanding how you interact with them, you know, can you negotiate? And you can. And so, and how you would do that. And then what is the chance that once they get you for decrypting your systems and getting your systems back up again, that they might not come back and say, okay, now we also stole your data. If you don't pay us more, we're going to put that on the internet. So, you know, understanding what those risks look like and how you manage it, it's complicated.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is, I think, I mean, Jim is absolutely right. And ransomware has evolved a lot. You know, threat actors are extremely sophisticated. They are basically using the tactics of, you know, sophisticated communications professionals. They communicate directly with media, with security experts. They are fighting, you know, for coverage, you know, with the media, etc. So it's a very different ball game, I'd say. So I completely agree with Jim. I think the baseline is just making sure you have backups of your systems, because essentially that's the starting point. But it's very good to have sort of thought through some of these things, and you know, we find that companies that have sort of gone through some kind of process preparing for this, whether it's, you know, through playbooks and so on, or simulations, can be quite helpful, because I think there's a couple of things. The first thing is, you know, besides actually getting you to pay a ransom to decrypt your system, very often they take your data as well. And so if they manage to access or exfiltrate data, they can sell it on the dark web and, you know, and make money. So there's kind of like a backup plan. So we see quite a lot of that, where we're not really sure, you know, whether the goal was just to decrypt the system and bring it down, or whether there's sort of data that's been exfiltrated as well. So that you know, creates problems. I think just having a really good understanding of what kind of data you hold in what servers, and you know, where your key assets are and so on, is quite critical, especially for businesses that are quite diverse and don't focus on just one type of product or service, because quite often we find that there's, you know, in the initial stages, quite a lot of time spent trying to figure out what actually may have been accessed. And I think having a clearer picture of that can be quite helpful. And then I think just general scenario planning, you know, if we do this, what might they do? And sort of role playing that and acting it out, because again, you know, we kind of have to do that almost live in various situations, and sort of put ourselves in the minds of the hackers and say, okay, look, if we did this, what are they going to do next? So it's I would say it's become a lot more sophisticated. It's changed a lot in the last couple of years.
And I mean, Victor, I'm sorry.
Please go ahead, Jim.
Just going to add that, you know, thinking about this from a board perspective, these are very hard, very good, very uncomfortable questions to put to the management team. So, you know, again, if you're collecting and processing personal information, the question to the management team would be, are you prepared for, you know, if this was stolen, what would you do? You know, I mean, could you pay? Could you not pay? You know, having those kinds of, you know, I mean, it can take a little bit of preparation, but you know, I don't think you don't need to be like the former black hat hacker gone good or anything like that, or vice versa. You know, I mean, it's something that these are very much business discussions, and you know, it's business discussions around a scenario that's quite common in sort of in the modern sort of business context. And you know, as a board member, pushing for answers is an important function, because you know, again, look, we got our certificate, we are ISO 27001 certified. And then you say, okay, click, you know, we've done our cybersecurity discussion for the year, and that's the wrong approach, because that's not about risk. It's just about compliance. Very, very different things.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important distinction to make. And it's so easy, particularly living in Singapore, where certification of all sorts is seen as the answer to a variety of risk and a variety of commercial challenges, and as a way of complying with regulation. But you're right, it's not the answer, or not the sole answer. You really do need to think about what you're trying to protect and how you're going to do that, and what would you do if you had to face one of these instances. I mean, what can a small business do, for example, where their customer database and whatever other systems they rely on, their finance data, for example, is subject to a ransomware attack, and they haven't got the resources to pay. So, if they don't have, as you mentioned straight up, Jim, sufficient backup, then they're in real trouble, because they are paralyzed from operating.
Yes, and people talk about cyber insurance. The cyber insurance industry is going to go poof next year. They've spent too much money paying out on claims, and so the nature of that product, that that risk transference product, where you're acquiring and you're acquiring cyber insurance, the conditions around that are going to change. The price around that is going to change, and so that you can argue whether or not that contributed to the growth of ransomware attacks and things like that. But I guess the secondary issue, just in practical terms, you need to understand that some of the resources that people have looked as being very modern, very contemporary, are about to go away. And so having an understanding of, again, when I say the controls aren't everything, that doesn't mean controls aren't still unimportant.
Of course.
Right. And so, things like that backup, again, scenario by scenario, what are the risks that you have? And then how well do you think you're managing it? And how well could you manage an incident associated with it?
And we talk a lot about data, but the other thing that's associated with ransomware is service disruptions, right? So you're a business, how long can you go on without providing a service? Now, that might be okay in retail. It might start becoming a problem in financial services or healthcare. So that those kinds of things as well is sort of it's very closely tied to business continuity, right? Because if systems are locked up, how are you going to do what you're supposed to be doing? And how do you potentially in the middle of a pandemic, if that affects healthcare organizations, we've got a huge problem. So it really is. I think Jim is absolutely right. It's about thinking about what the bigger consequences are. It's not about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is almost just the cause, or the bigger issue is what's going to happen to your business.
Indeed.
Very much so. And just to go back to your comment on cyber insurance, we have a question from John, who quite typically asks one of the best questions, which is, it's increasingly difficult to get. It's increasingly expensive when you do get it. Do you think it's essential? Question.
No, because it is too difficult to get and it's too expensive. So look, when you think about that risk function, and if you have a big organization or a small organization, insurance is one part of it. But there's a whole other things. There's a controls aspect. There's a preparation for incident. There's all the different things that go into it. Cyber insurance is just one element of it. It very much depends on your situation. Also, I mean, and by that I mean, like, what is your risk tolerance? To go back to what Sunita was talking about, at the beginning, that's a very important factor. But also, what is your budget for things like that? And so the one thing that's important, and that aspect of doing that financial analysis around cybersecurity assets and what the impact would be in financial terms, it's complicated. And what we've seen is that the insurance firms, who theoretically should be the best at it, have been challenged by that. That's why so many of them are exiting the business. Yep,
understood. Sunita, any comments or thoughts on the topic of cyber security insurance?
I don't really have anything very specific to add on the topic of insurance, but I think one of the good things about thinking about these things and engaging with the insurers is also sort of the collateral benefits of making sure you have a team to help you if something happens. You know, the problem is incidents. I mean, let's face it, you know, most organizations wait till something goes wrong before they activate all of this, right? So we're talking about preparation, we're talking about simulations, but all of that's very much in the ideal world. You'll find a lot of organizations only start thinking about this when a crisis actually happens. The problem then is, who do you call, right? If you haven't thought about any of this, you know, who's going to help you with the forensics? Who's going to help, you know, do you have a law firm to help you with regulatory requirements and notifications and that kind of thing? And I think one thing that generally that insurance process does is gets you to engage on who are the external parties that may, you know, that I may need to help me if something happens. So I think it's just worth going through that process. I mean, insurance may not be for everyone, but that process of thinking through, what do I need to have lined up ahead of something happening, or, you know, some kind of incident is very important.
Thank you. There aren't any other questions in the Q&A, so maybe I could invite you both to maybe make some closing remarks on the sort of key takeaways for our audience today when they're serving on boards, on company boards, either now or in the future, and what they should be thinking about when it comes to the topic of cybersecurity.
All right, I can kick off. And so look, I think a couple of things have emerged from what we discussed today. I think typically, you know, from what we've seen, there's always a little bit of an aversion to cybersecurity because it's a very technical thing, you know, and a lot of people like to say, I'm not very technical, so I don't really do this. And I think it's really important to remember that not everybody needs to be a technical expert. And I think, again, you know, based on what we've discussed today, it really is about looking at what is going to result, what are some of the outcomes for the business if it's faced with a cyber attack, you know, whether it's disruption to the business, whether it's loss of data, you know, whether it's litigation, whether it's fines. And those are really the things I think that boards and management teams should be focusing on. And then you sort of look at, you know, what is your risk tolerance around these areas, and what do you need to be doing, and, you know, what do you need to be strengthening to make sure that, you know, you're protecting yourself against these types of issues. And that's where the technical people come in. But, you know, a lot of this is not necessarily technical. It's a business issue. It's a very critical business issue. And I think it's really important that boards get into that kind of mindset, because otherwise there's a tendency to say, oh, it's very technical, you know, we'll leave that to the security people, we'll leave that to the technologists. And that's not right. This is not a technology issue, it's a business issue. So I think that's really the first thing. The second thing is, I think to a large degree, what's actually useful is bringing in a lot of different perspectives on these issues, right? Because people who are looking at this from a purely technology lens tend to be quite, you know, can end up being quite one-dimensional. They may be very good at what they do, but sort of thinking about questions about, you know, what might happen if we do this, or have we planned for this, or, you know, how are these trends affecting, you know, how we respond to a cyber incident. I think these are all very important questions. And the reality is, I think boards just need to be challenging management and asking the right questions. They don't necessarily need to have all the answers. And that's, again, something to bear in mind. And really, I think the third thing is, you know, what we've been saying. I still think today that in Asia, there is a tendency to look at cybersecurity and data as like an IT issue. And it's absolutely critical, particularly given the rise in data breaches and ransomware attacks, that all businesses take this threat extremely seriously. The other thing as well that I'd say is regulation is changing right across the region. I think a lot of Asian regulators are paying more attention to this now. We've seen some new laws coming into play in China, which have attracted a lot of attention, but equally in other parts of in other parts of Asia and in Southeast Asia. And so it's really important to be aware of, not just the business risk, but the reputational risk, the legal and regulatory risk, and really understand what this means for the business, and then make sure that you have an absolutely foolproof strategy, to just prepare yourself for whatever might come your way.
Thank you. Very good points. Jim.
And let me kind of follow up with some of Sunita's points. First talking about in a typical board function, business as usual, that BAU of the once or twice a year when these things do come up in a board. I think what's important for the board is to push the management team and to push on some of these issues, exactly as Sunita was talking about, around not defining this as technology issues, defining them as business problems, and trying to get, instead of something, okay, we're ready for ransomware, a tangible description of this is what we think the risk would look like. This is how it could impact our operations. This is how we're mitigating it. And this is what we're going to do in case something goes wrong. So that first part of it is really an active engagement. And again, remember this is that a board role is a fiduciary role with responsibility. This is not a jolly. This is not just to pick up, get your bento box of lunch and pick up your paycheck and walk out the door. There's a significant responsibility to the organization that's part of that. And so, and asking hard questions of the management team and making sure that the management team understands what those issues are. What is the management team, doing to change the organization? What is the management, how well does the management team recognize what these risks are? That's what a board should really do in that BAU context. Now let's talk a little bit when something does go wrong, sort of the response phase around an incident. Now, very simply, the board actually really, in most cases, should do nothing in that situation, just because they're not, they're typically, the management team is not necessarily so operational, the board even less so. There may be issues though, as soon as you talked about, in case, do we pay a ransom, do we not pay a ransom? These are things that may have sort of a material exposure from a regulatory perspective, perhaps a material exposure from a financial perspective. And so, these situations may be something where you cannot convene the whole board at any one given moment. And so having the right kind of some recognition of what these situations could be like, and understanding of what are the hard decisions that may need to be taken around these kinds of events, having the board being prepared to support in that context and to support the management team and again, provide some advice. We have seen cases where, depending on where you are, what your sector is, and depending on the scale of the incident, that the board can becomes very much involved in stakeholder management. So that could be stakeholder management, for sector regulators. It could be stakeholder management in some cases with the media. We've seen that, at some stages, like a commission of inquiry led by a board member for very high profile public incidents. That's something that, at that scale, that's kind of a bit extreme. But the last thing that I would I'll leave you with is that last stage where the board really has an opportunity to significantly add value to the organization around cybersecurity incidents and managing them, or at least is in recovery. So once you've gone through all this stuff, right, when you have a significant cybersecurity incident, it changes your organization, because in one way, shape, or form, your organization failed. And so where the board really comes in that context is to make sure that the management team comes up with a credible plan, right? So we talk about 5 different, I won't go into the details of it, there's 5 different kinds of impacts from a cybersecurity incident. Those impacts can go up and down over time. And so having the board that has that oversight and says, okay, that we're looking at an 18-month process. Our responsibility as a board around this is overseeing the additional costs that we have to spend. What are the technical controls? How are we evaluating it? How are we managing our reputational impact? How are we managing our regulatory impact? That's where the board, and a strong board, can really, really provide something much more than showing up for your bento box and your paycheck. It's about really, ensuring that the company recognizes what went wrong and helps transition to a more risk-informed approach.
Thank you very much. Very insightful comments from both our expert practitioners. Boards are there for governance, oversight, advice. And in order for them to do that, they have to be engaged in the commercial success of the business And there's no doubt that cybersecurity is not a technical issue alone. It is a people, process, and therefore cultural issue in the broadest sense, where everybody in an organization is accountable and has a role to play to protect the data and the systems they use to function and to provide their customers with goods and services in order to sustain their own business. So thank you both very much indeed for your time. Thank the audience too, and particularly those members who asked questions. So ladies and gentlemen, if you do have further issues about how to manage cybersecurity in your business, you've now been introduced to two experts in Jim and Sunita. And I just want to close by thanking them both and thanking you. If you've got new ideas for this series in terms of themes or topics, don't hesitate to let us know at heretohelp@sicc.com.sg. We look forward to seeing you at our events as we complete 2021. And from me and my team and from our two guest speakers, goodbye for now. Thank you so much.